In this topic, you will learn about the impact of the legislation code field, see where it is mandatory, and understand the impact on data. Legislation fields are found in many of the setup tables and required on 5. In the company, the legislation defines the rules for accounting and setup. Legislation at the company level ensures a valid set of accounting entries when posting. In account classification, the legislation is taken into consideration when creating a chart of accounts in order to link the chart of accounts with the account class. In accounting aggregation parameters for purchasing, inventory, and manufacturing, legislation is used for consistency and flow. When entering accounting aggregations, there are specific fields which will be used to differentiate the movements to prevent the aggregation. For example, if the user wants one entry per product, the field which contains the product must be entered in one of the 5 key fields. For inventory entries, key fields 1 through 5 can be an expression that contain constants, functions, operators, and fields from the STOJO table. For purchasing or manufacturing entries, key fields 1 through 5 can be expressions that use constants, functions, operators, and fields from the WIP cost table. The user must therefore enter in key 1 to key 5 the criteria differentiating the entries, knowing that 2 different sets of criteria always correspond to 2 different accounting entries. If all the key fields are equal, a single entry containing as many lines as necessary is created. These lines can be aggregated by the same account, nature, tax code, and entry title with the automatic journal. This is a USA legislation schema on the financial module. In this schema, legislation is mainly used as a data filter with some consistency control to automatically post to the USA legislation. The USA legislation is put onto the BP tax rule. If legislation is linked to a tax rule, it will only be possible to use this tax rule with companies of the same legislation. Product tax level. A product is not related to a legislation, but the tax level that is assigned to the product can be associated with a legislation. The tax determination is a combination between the BP tax rule and the product tax level in order to give the correct tax rate to use in transactions. Legislation at the tax determination level is used to select tax elements corresponding to the legislation. Tax rate defines the tax rate that can be applied to a sale or a purchase. If a legislation is linked to a tax rate, this tax rate will be used only with companies sharing the same legislation. The accounting code entry transaction defines the list of chart of accounts within each accounting propagation to be carried out, legislation being specified if necessary. It is a transversal function making some correspondence between the ledger that must be consistent, sensitive point in multi-legislation folder setup. So it may be advisable to leave the legislation code empty. And finally, the accounting code defines the accounting allocation terms for the entries automatically generated by the system's automatic journals. A same accounting code can impact several chart of accounts from the same or different legislations. Let's take a look at legislations in your system. The company requires legislation to be set. Let's go look at the company setup. We'll select the company's function under the Setup menu. And we'll pull up company NA20. Notice that we have our legislation set to USA. If we jump to our Accounting tab and then jump to our Account Core Model, and from here jump to our ledger, it's associated with our legal ledger, and then jump to our chart of accounts associated with that ledger, you will notice that when we come into the chart of accounts on the plan, we do have our default account class, which is another required field. Another area that requires legislation are in the aggregate setups. So if we come down to the accounting aggregation parameter setup, you'll notice we can sort by legislation. Each one of these parameters has their key value entered, but they all require legislation. Let's take a look at the tax setup. A BP tax roll can have a tax legislation. I can also sort by my legislation. We have our legislation filter here. We can also set up our tax level, which comes into our product. Let's look at this, though, from our product. We'll scroll down to the product function. We'll pull up a finished good, and we'll come to the Financials tab. Notice it does not have any legislation on the product, but it does have a tax level. And if we jump to the tax level, you can see that we can enter a legislation code here as well. The tax determination, which is a combination between the BP tax roll and the tax level, can also have a filter of the legislation entered. And finally, tax rates can have a legislation associated with them as well. Legislation can be used when doing certain types of reports and functions. If we go into our financials module and we look at our final validation process, which is a process that needs to be run to convert batches from temporary to final status, you'll notice that if we select all companies, we are forced to enter in a legislation. If we unselect all companies and enter in a company code, our legislation will fill in for us when we go to run our process. In this topic, you have learned the importance of the legislation fields, the impact on your data, and finally, monthly and annual reports can be done by companies of the same or different legislations.